This presentation explores the art of mentoring, which is a key piece of the internship experience for our students. It's the second part of your role as supervisor mentor, and it's somewhat of a much more nebulous or less straightforward dimension of the work that you'll be doing with our students. In other words, the supervisory role has a number of concrete tasks associated with it. Mentoring, on the other hand, is a lot harder to define. It's much more about the ways that you leverage your wisdom as an experienced practitioner in your ministry setting to journey with students who are beginning to learn who they are as ministry leaders and are beginning to explore their own journey in the life and work of ministry. There are lots of ways of defining what a mentor is, but one definition that I have found helpful is this one from Barbara Blodgett, who writes that a mentor is a wise, trusted, and experienced person who takes an interest in the life and career of a novice and commits to helping him or her grow into a role. And so there are a number of pieces to this definition that we're going to explore in this presentation. The first is around the idea of what it means to be a wise, trusted, and experienced person. The second is what it means to take an interest in the life and career of a novice. And the third is around the idea of a commitment to helping that novice grow into their role. Earlier in this module, I defined ministry as a particular kind of space-making work, as making space for persons and communities to discern and respond to God's work in their midst. And mentoring is another kind of space-making work, and in that way is its own kind of ministry. One way of defining what mentoring is around this notion of space is to say that it is intentionally making space for students to claim a ministerial identity and to develop the skills and practices of ministry in light of who they are and how God is calling them into ministry. And so right off the bat, mentoring is attentive to the uniqueness of every person's calling or sense of purpose. That, in other words, we're not trying to make people over in the image of the expert or the veteran, but good mentors are attentive to the particular journeys that the novices are on. I think a key practice and a key framing for the work of mentoring is around the idea of discernment. In the practice of discernment, as it's understood in theological terms, a person is continually open to the many ways in which God may be calling them to respond to God in their lives or calling the communities that they lead to respond to God. And a good mentor is a discerning mentor. And that discernment starts first about themselves. Good mentors are aware that they are in a continual process of growth and a continual orientation and stance of openness to the new ways in which God is calling them. That is to say that good mentors are never in some kind of posture of understanding that they are somehow a finished product, that they have nowhere left to go. And so a good mentor leverages their posture of discernment to position and assist novices who are themselves in a place of discernment about their beginning work in ministry and their beginning understanding of who they are as ministry leaders. So the mentor offers his or her expertise and expertise for the student to consider as she reflects on her own beginning experiences in ministry. So expertise matters, but in the framework of discernment, expertise does not become a sense that the mentor is the end-all be-all and the novice student just needs to grow into that mentor's mold or image. But instead, the mentor uses their expertise to journey with, to journey alongside, to meet the student where the student is in their own particular path in ministry. So mentoring is a kind of a balance and a challenge. And it is the challenge of offering and leveraging one's own expertise as a seasoned veteran in the work that they're doing in order to meet and assist a novice person in their own particular journey in the same work without over leveraging that expertise in order to suggest that the novice needs to be just like you. They're not just like you. They have their own calling, they have their own sense of purpose, but they can benefit from the ways that you have learned how to do the work. And the challenge is to figure out how to use your own point of view, your own orientation to the profession, your own expertise in order to best position the novice, the student, to learn who they are and what they're about in their work in ministry. So this suggests that mentoring avoids two different poles. On the one hand, mentoring is not an attempt to remake the student over in the mentor's own image. It's not a sense that I am a finished product, I am perfect, and you need to be just like me. But on the other hand, neither is mentoring giving the student free rein to do ministry unsupervised without constructive feedback. So it's not as though we're being so rigid that our expectation is student interns whom we're mentoring become just like us, but it's also not completely free and unstructured. That there are ways of leveraging what we know as seasoned professionals and veterans to help the student develop a better sense of their own identity and formation in ministry without letting that expertise overdetermine their own growth process. I mentioned before that there are three interrelated aspects of ministry that offer themselves as learning opportunities in the context of ministry internship placements. Those are the being, the doing, and the thinking of ministry. And similarly, there are kind of three foci of mentoring, three areas of attention or focus that good mentors can help their mentees pay attention to: the being, the doing, and the thinking. Where the being piece, again, has to do with questions around a person's professional identity, their presence, their voice and authority in ministry that they begin to develop in internship work and other experiences. The doing piece has to do with learning the practices and skills of ministry, preaching, pastoral care, administration, education, whatever are the practices relevant to ministry in a particular kind of ministry context or setting. And then finally, the thinking of ministry, which has to do with the art of theological reflection, the skills involved in leveraging different forms of theological knowledge to make meaning and to help others to make meaning of experiences in life. So it's not easy always to have a ready answer to the question, what is the real content of the work of ministry? What are the themes or ideas or tropes that we are exploring with students? And so the next several slides, I try to give you a sense of what some of these content areas might be as it pertains to working with students who are preparing for ministry. And I've organized them around these three ideas of being, thinking, and doing. And so, for example, around the question of being, and this is not an exhaustive list, but some issues might be around the way that students are developing an awareness of their identity as a minister, their gifts and passions, their energies, their opportunities for growth, and so on. Another theme has to do with the way that students could get in touch with their own complexity as selves. A lot of what happens in ministry, as many of you know, is that we, whether we're aware of it or not, we bring all of ourselves into the ways that we offer ministry to others. That is to say, all of the ways in which we've been formed in our families and communities of origin and significant life experiences and relationships. And we do much better when we are aware of how those things are present, not because we need to fix them, but because they are there, whether we want them to be or not. And so helping students to surface how those major formational themes in their lives are present in their work in ministry is another important area for mentoring. So some other issues related to the being category. One, that students wrestle with the challenge of claiming authority as a ministry leader. Students are often, in our internship experiences, challenged to claim their own presence as a leader in their internship setting. Second, that students develop an awareness of how other persons experience them in ministry situations and how their presence shapes those ministry situations. So just developing some self-awareness about how others receive them in the work that they're doing and how that might shape their ongoing work in ministry. Three, that students develop an awareness of how they deal with stress and conflict, especially interpersonal and relational conflict. How do students either lean in or maybe are inclined to run away from relational tension? And there's always relational tension in ministry, and how do they respond to that? That students continue to work on discerning more fully what their calling and sense of vocation is through their internship work. And finally, that students understand that what fuels their work in ministry is a vibrant relationship with God. So an important area for mentoring in many settings is helping students to be in touch with how they're trying to connect with God, what struggles they have in that work, and what are the regular and daily practices of cultivating that relationship that will sustain their work in ministry. Some growth opportunities for the second big bucket, the doing bucket, which relates to the skills and practices of ministry. One is that students learn that ministry is in the first place about being faithful, not being successful. And this is kind of a countercultural norm that it's important oftentimes for students who are starting to explore vocations in ministry to learn that ultimately what makes ministry distinctive, or part of what makes ministry distinctive as a profession, is that we are responding to God's call. Even when we are not successful in responding to God's call in the way that we think we should be, that's actually not the ultimate criterion of goodness for ministry. And of course, it's not that we don't want students to be successful, but ultimately being faithful is a foundational norm. Another growth opportunity for doing has to do with the way that ministry requires initiative. I like to say to students that ministry is not a just tell me what to do kind of profession. In other words, sometimes students, particularly our younger students, feel disoriented when they show up and there's no one there in the ministry setting to give them a to-do list of the 5 or 6 or 8 things they have to do today before they go home. We of course want students to have some structure. We want them to have a sense of what they should be doing and what goals they're trying to achieve, and that's why we use the learning plan, as I discussed earlier. But it's also important for students to learn that ministry requires that they really just lean in to whatever's going on. And oftentimes what's going on is not what they thought was going to be on their to-do list, but it's important nonetheless. And so developing that sense of initiative is an important growth opportunity for doing. Of course, another one is that students have opportunities to practice the skills of ministry that are relevant in your internship setting, and to have opportunities to reflect on that practice. So we're wanting them to get better at the things that they need to learn in order to be effective leaders in the setting. And that finally, that students begin to discern their own voice or style or identity in the practices of ministry. So there's no one way of doing administration. There's no one way of doing fundraising. There's no way of doing preaching or pastoral care or whatever it is. What we want students to start to learn, they may not learn it entirely in divinity school. I know they won't, but to start to learn not just what it means to do these practices well, but what it means for them as unique persons to do those practices in ways that reflect their own gifts and personality and energy. As for that last big bucket, the thinking bucket, some growth opportunities there. First, that students develop the skill of describing without yet judging their ministry setting. So we want students to be able to create thick and complicated descriptions of what is going on. Instead of first reacting or responding to a situation they don't fully understand, or a community or a context they don't fully understand, we want them to be able to ask the question, what is really going on here? And to be able to explore that question in terms of a variety of different lenses: social, cultural, economic, historical, and so on. And so we want them to be able to practice that skill as a skill of analysis for ministry. And then secondly, that students learn to interpret their experience through the lenses of scripture, theological traditions and framings, pastoral, homiletical, and liturgical practices, and so on. In other words, how can they leverage all of the really great theological information that we're providing to them in our seminary classrooms in order to make meaning on experience, meaning from the experiences that they're having in their internship work. I often like to tell students that ministry leaders they're certainly not the only theological meaning makers in a setting, but their job is kind of to be meaning maker in chief. That it is their job to position others to be able to understand how God is present and working in a context, or in a season, or in a relationship, or in a significant life or cultural or historical event. And so they need to practice that skill. And too often, I think, in theological education, we assume that if you can pass all the exams and write all the papers in the classroom setting, then it's obvious how you leverage or mobilize or operationalize all of that information to help make meaning out of experience. Well, of course, that's not true. This is a skill like any other, and like any skill, it needs to be practiced. So we hope that that's one thing that they're able to do in their internship work. And then finally, that students understand how theological reflection informs continuing action, and vice versa. And this goes back to that spiral, action-reflection spiral that I discussed earlier, that students are practicing, acting, performing, doing work in their internship setting. And they take some space, hopefully in conversation with you and their peers, to reflect on what they learned in doing that action and practice. And then based on their reflection and the insights that come out of their reflection, they go back and do that practice or action or performance in a more informed way. So we hope that that is also an opportunity in their internship work. So another important question that you'll want to know the answer to is, when does mentoring happen? And roughly speaking, it happens in two broad ways. It happens in the formal 1-hour mentoring sessions that we would like for you to do each week with our students. And we'll talk about how to structure those in just a minute. But it also happens on the fly. There are lots of times when a situation arises in a ministry setting where you might be able to pull the student in to assist in the way that you're responding, or to ask them or invite them to respond to the same situation in a certain way. And so my encouragement in identifying these on-the-fly situations is just to have your eyes open to them. When things come up on a day-to-day basis, things that you may or may not have anticipated, what are ways to get students involved in responding, or perhaps assisting you to respond to those situations? So I had a congregational minister I worked for in my internship work who always liked to pull me into situations. For example, when people would call on the phone with pastoral concerns, he would answer the call, and then when the call was over, if I was at the church at the time, or if I came later in the day, he would pull me aside and say, "This person called with this concern. How might you have responded?" And then we spent some time talking about how he responded, how I might have responded, and use that as an opportunity to learn about pastoral care. So just be aware of the on-the-fly opportunities for mentoring, in addition to the formal 1 hour per week that you'll be spending with students. The more formal opportunity for mentoring is the 1 hour meeting with students that we would like for you to do in the summer of 2020 at least 6 times during the course of the internship placement. May not be quite one a week, but perhaps about one a week. So 6 hours of formal mentoring work. It's important at the outset of the summer when you all are organizing your internship placement using the learning plan to find a regular place and time for those mentoring sessions to happen and to identify those and put them on the calendar ahead of time. It's best to find a time and place where you will not be interrupted. So that won't maybe not as difficult in the remote format. And we'll talk about remote mentoring in a bit. And it's certainly fine for those times to change, but we find that these sessions happen more readily if they're scheduled up front and then some adjustments are made later on, rather than just saying, oh, we'll get to it and then never getting to it. So do schedule a regular time at the beginning of the summer, and if you need to make adjustments, that's certainly fine. So we already talked some about some themes that mentors can work with their students to focus on. And part of what we do at the beginning of the internship placement in the learning plan is to ask you and the student to have some conversation about the kinds of things the student would like to learn, so that you have an idea about how to approach your mentoring work with them. Another way to think about this is around several contexts of reflection. One being the professional context, and this is reflection related to the student's practice of ministry. So this is the doing of ministry, including the assessment of ministry skills and the student's effectiveness in practicing ministry. So you can use an hour to reflect on the sermon that the student gave that week, or on the meeting they convened, or on the fundraising materials they developed, and to talk with them about how they went about doing that, what you thought worked well with that, where you think they might spend a little more time, and that sort of thing. Again, here in critiquing skills and practices, it's always best to give concrete, specific feedback related to actions, rather than saying, you're a great person. Say, here's what I think you did well, here's what we may need to reconsider in terms of opportunities for further growth. A second is the interpersonal context, and this is reflection on the student's pastoral presence and intervention in human relationships relevant to ministry. So this is, how do students provide ministry, and particularly pastoral care, to persons in a setting? How do they experience that? And how do they experience the way that they're received by others, how others understand their presence in ministry, how others may or may not challenge their authority as ministry leaders, and those kinds of questions. A third is systemic context, and this is reflection on the student's capacity to work within organizations and their ability to understand the structural dynamics that make organizations work the way they do, for better or for worse. So this is in particular the kinds of family systems questions. How are power relationships structured in any organizational setting? Who are the persons with formal and informal power? How do things get done? What happens when there is tension or anxiety in relationships in the system? How does that typically get dealt with, for better or for worse? And I would also add to this kind of larger cultural issues. What does it mean for a particular organization to be situated in a particular geographic, cultural, historical context, and how does the student learn how to operationalize that information in the way that they lead in that context? Another context is theological, reflection on God's work in a ministry setting, as well as reflection on the theological commitments, explicit and implicit, formal and functional, that condition that student's ministry in the setting. So not only for individuals, leaders, ministers, lay people, employees, guests, all of these folks and organizations themselves, and faith communities themselves, have both what we call formal and functional theological claims. The formal theological claims being the ones that persons and communities say about themselves. So when you see a sign in front of a church that says, our doors are open to all, there's a kind of formal theological claim, God's doors are open to all. And the functional theological claims are the ones that people say they believe, but their behaviors may belie or reveal a different kind of belief based on the way that they navigate the world. So if that sign says, God loves everyone and our doors are open to all, and yet in navigating that space, one finds out that the doors really aren't open to everyone. They're only open to certain kinds of people. That would be a tension between a formal and a functional theological claim. So one way to work with a student in a mentoring context is to explore those claims, not only for themselves, what they say they believe versus what their behavior shows about what they actually believe, but also for the organizations that you're working in. And finally, the vocational context has to do with reflection on a student's calling to an emerging sense of identity in ministry in light of the internship at work and other relevant experiences. So how is this internship experience shaping the way that the student is feeling called to a larger sense of purpose or vocation in their ministry trajectory? So a few specific ideas about how to structure weekly reflection meetings. One would be to discuss and reflect theologically on a ministry event, either a performance or a skill that was practiced or a relational encounter or a cultural event like COVID-19, something that happens that is discrete, that lends itself to theological reflection. That might be one way of structuring that conversation, then exploring what it has to do with ministry. Another would be to discuss progress on learning goals or growth areas as outlined in the learning plan. And the shape the conversation there might take would be a kind of coaching conversation where you're asking, what is it that the student wants to achieve and what do they need to do in order to get to that goal or get to those goals? Finally, oftentimes mentors will use a book or an article or a video or some other kind of material around a particular theme that's relevant to the work of the ministry setting to frame a discussion of what's happening there. So that'd be another way of structuring those meetings. One of our veteran mentors suggested this three-point framework for structuring the weekly 1-hour meeting. And it's around 3 questions. What's going well in your ministry this week? What feels challenging and why? And what can I or we do to better support you in your work? That's just a nice way, even to start the hour. It doesn't have to be the only thing you talk about in the hour, but a way to kind of get things going. And as a pattern, it becomes a kind of predictable starting off point that the student will know, will be familiar with going into that time. This veteran also suggested that it's helpful to get out of the office, go for a walk, to get the wheels turning. In the summer of 2020, that may not be a live possibility since we're all going to be doing mentoring in a remote and distanced way. But under normal circumstances, that is a very useful suggestion. I want to signal a few ideas about what the mentoring session is not, and 3 things in particular. Firstly, the mentoring session is not primarily an administrative meeting. So the goal should not be to spend the entire time looking at calendars and planning out things for the next period of time. It should really be a space for processing and for reflection. That isn't to say that it's not okay for some administrative work to happen. That's certainly fine, but it should not primarily be an administrative planning meeting. It's also not a therapy session. We don't expect that you're trained therapists. We don't expect that you should provide therapy to students. There are certainly ways in which the kinds of reflective conversations that happen in a mentoring relationship verge into issues that may require some therapy, and it can be a little difficult sometimes to discern when the conversations are going that way. But to the extent that they are, the responsible thing to do is just to suggest that the student take up that conversation with a therapist and perhaps to provide some resources or direct them to me. I can provide some resources. But we're certainly not expecting that supervisor mentors will do that for students. And finally, a mentoring session is not a monologue. It's not an hour of the wise sage transferring in a kind of transactional way all of the great wisdom they have in a lecture to the student. It's a dialogue, it's a conversation, and it's a meaning-making conversation in the ways we've discussed above. One of the tricky things about mentoring conversations is that the goal is to open or facilitate reflection rather than to prescribe reflection. Most of the time, we're not going to begin conversations with a judgment like, you should have done it this way. There might be some limited circumstances in which that is appropriate. But most of the time, the goal is to get at the student, to help the student understand their own process for how and why they did certain things, and then to invite them perhaps to consider other or more expansive ways to think about those issues. And so to do that, it's often helpful to ask open-ended open-ended questions rather than to offer prescriptive judgments or comments. And open-ended questions would begin with phrases like, I am struck by, I noticed that, tell me more about, or I'm curious about. I'm curious about why you made the decision to go from one image to another image in your sermon. Or I'm struck by the question that you asked that parishioner about how they're experiencing the loss of their neighbor. You know, the oftentimes open-ended questions communicate the idea of, tell me more about that, or help me understand why you did it that way. Not necessarily because you think they did it the wrong way, but just because it helps students to get to have a better sense of their own motivation and orientation to situations. So think in terms of engaging, not advising, and think of terms of asking open-ended questions rather than offering judgments or prescribing reflection. When it comes to helping interns think about how they performed in certain situations, particular situations, I find the advice that my colleague Barbara Blodgett to be very helpful. She makes the distinction between praise and feedback, where praise is a kind of blanket statement or judgment about how good a person is, without explaining what in particular they are good at and what's good about it. Whereas feedback is directed not so much at the person, but at the action or performance or practices that the person engaged in. And it's a statement about the nature of what someone did rather than who they are. Feedback is directed not toward a person's attributes, but towards their performance and actions. And I'll say more about that in the next slide. So Blodgett offers some advice on how to give feedback well. And the first bit of advice is, don't praise people, only what they do. For example, that was a really good sermon is better than, you're a really great preacher. Because saying that was a really good sermon gives you an opportunity to say just what was good about it, and maybe also some opportunity to invite some consideration about how the sermon could be stronger or richer the next time around. Secondly, make feedback as specific as possible. For example, even better than, that was a really good sermon, is, that was a good sermon because you made us think about the gospel passage in a new way, and then name that way in which that was new. Third, avoid, this is a hard one because particularly folks in ministry always want to offer affirmation and praise when they can. But there are times when it's really hard to do that, when the student has done something that really did not turn out the way that anyone intended. But the third bit of advice is to avoid any praise you have to contrive. And Blodgett notes that if necessary, you can express your gratitude for the contribution rather than praise for the performance. So don't lie. You know, if something really required another practice round or some more thought, then in as polite a way as you can, share that, and then offer gratitude for the attempt. And then finally, number 4, avoid praise that sets up competition. For example, you're the best intern we've ever had. Praise in terms of competition is not very helpful. Again, go for the specific feedback on the concrete things that the student did. This last set of slides offers some suggestions about mentoring in remote formats. This summer 2020, because of the continuing public health crisis, all mentoring will need to be done remotely until Wake Forest University policy changes, which I imagine will not be during the course of the summer. And so that sets up a new challenge for mentoring, because ordinarily these programs assume that the mentoring is happening in person. So my colleagues in field and education and I have been thinking about how we can best prepare our mentors to do mentoring in remote formats. And we've created some advice, and since this is new, I'm sure we'll have lots more to learn this summer, but these next several slides just offer some preliminary ideas about how best to do this. And this set of comments is offered by my colleague, Matt Floating, who also is a field educator. And he says that the first thing we can do is be aware that the relationship begins now. So be proactive about creating that relationship with the student before the student even begins, making time for face-to-face conversations virtually, sharing stories with one another, talking about how the pandemic is affecting each of you, exchanging stories about formational experiences so that you have a better sense of how you got to be who you are and how your student got to be who they are. Share some personal trivia, favorite food, best movie in the last year, and so on. And also communicate your availability to students. Another piece of advice that Floating offers is to welcome well. That is, determine the best ways for your intern to be introduced to your staff and congregation or nonprofit organization and volunteer leaders, including your website, Zoom, the newsletter, or host a virtual welcome reception. The idea here is in whatever ways that people are paying attention to your organization in virtual space, be sure to welcome your intern, help your constituents know who the person is and what role they're serving in and how long they're going to be there, what they're going to be doing, that sort of thing, so that they can get used to the presence of your intern in your organizational setting. Another tip in this virtual space is that it can be helpful, I think, to over-communicate, to keep everyone working with the same information. There are lots of ways to do that, but some include following up your virtual meetings with a summary email, invite an email summary response from your intern with an action list, and deadlines and due dates, and provide your intern with an appropriate list of participants' contact information. Next, it's important to help your student identify learning goals, and we've already talked quite a bit about this, but just by way of review, the learning plan invites your intern to identify as specifically as possible what they would like their learning to focus on, and to share. It's also important for you to share what your unique context can teach them virtually. So what is it that makes the learning experience in your internship setting unique? What might students learn in your setting that they might not learn in other places? And finally, share what you as a supervisor mentor may best be able to teach and mentor virtually. It's also important in this virtual space to create a routine on the idea that well-being and resilience benefit from regular rhythms and practices. So that includes things like setting up a weekly schedule with regular features and commitments, committing to a regular time for theological reflection, as we've talked about, encouraging Sabbath and rest and times for sustaining spiritual practices, working with your student to create a self-care plan, which might include a list of people that the student can contact for support or distraction, and a list of healthy practices for dealing with stress. And finally, working with the student to acknowledge honestly the difficulties of a virtual internship. So, you're not going to be in the same physical space on a day-to-day basis where you can check in on scheduling and check in on what needs to happen. So as best you can, creating a routine will be a key practice in this virtual space. Another important aspect, and this is the issue that we're all struggling with in remote and online spaces, is the challenge of building and fostering community. And we're all learning how to do this remotely, and the wisdom about that is still emerging. But it's also a challenge for creating a beneficial mentoring experience. So some tips around that would be to invite the congregation or the organization to get creative in welcoming your intern, which we've already identified. Emails, Zoom, or Skype chats, and even silly videos can help your intern feel connected. Encourage others to try a virtual lunch or coffee break with your intern. Offer contacts of persons with special expertise to your intern to meet virtually with their permission. And inviting your intern to all team meetings and any committee meetings that they might enjoy learning from. The last tip and the last slide in this presentation is to finish strong on the idea that rituals validate our experience. So what are the formal ways, not only of opening, but also of finishing and closing the internship experience? Not only for you and your student, but also for the organization, so that the organization knows that the student is coming to the end of their time, and that the organization is clear on what contributions the student has made during that time. And so these would be things like completing internship evaluations and discussing them, which we've talked about, celebrating the time of shared ministry and growth that you both have experienced, and throwing a virtual party with your congregation or organization to celebrate your time together.